With every new installment in the world's biggest franchise, it feels like the same conversation is rehashed, that cinema is dying. Often it's these conversations, or more likely arguments, that end up dominating the discourse around the newest project in the MCU. The projects themselves aren't the focal point of the discussion, rather it's the wider context of the state of cinema and how Marvel and Disney fits into this system. This leads to people getting extremely defensive of their favourite franchise films, or on the other hand, people attacking the same franchise films for silencing original films made by their favourite creatives. In this video, I want to explore the state of cinema as it stands, and what it might look like going forward, but as a fan and enjoyer of both camps of films. And to try and answer the question, is Marvel killing cinema? There were obviously discussions of the threat of franchise films before the MCU got to the status of global domination that it's at now, but the discourse around this question didn't really explode until Martin Scorsese made a comment about them in 2019 to Empire magazine. In that interview, Scorsese likened Marvel films to theme park rides and said they weren't cinema. It was this comment that seemed to spiral into this debate over the MCU that is still as prominent as ever. The onslaught of comments Scorsese received led him to addressing such criticism in his essay published in the New York Times. It's in this essay that he clarifies what he meant by this comment. In it, he laments that his intention was not to attack such films or the craft, as he notes there is a tremendous amount of talent working on Marvel films, but more so the consumption and domination of such films in cinemas. Now, do I agree with everything in this essay? No. Scorsese clearly subscribes to the auteur theory, which I vehemently disagree with, and suggests that the sameness of such franchise films is due to there being no unifying vision of an individual artist. That in itself is enough to create a discussion on the role of Feige in the MCU and the creative control of the creatives who work on Marvel projects, but I'm going to steer clear of that. The main intention of Scorsese's essay, though, I think is very hard to disagree with. It's simply a warning for a certain type of film disappearing and being replaced by sequels, reboots, and more installments in the world's biggest franchises. I think that the reason this essay and Scorsese's comments in general have become such a moot point over the last few years has simply been a misunderstanding of what Scorsese meant by cinema. His definition of cinema is based on the films he grew up with, ones that he deems to be all about the characters and the complexities of real people. They were revelations to him, something completely new and unique on screen, something no one had seen before. There was real risk in the films back then. They weren't what audiences wanted necessarily, there was an allure and a mystery to what the film had to offer, something which Scorsese argues is missing from most franchises. And is he wrong? Marvel have been criticised countless times on following the Marvel formula, and despite me loving a lot of the MCU and would argue that there are some that don't, there are a lot that do. This isn't solely a Marvel problem. Most blockbuster franchises exhibit formulaic storytelling, to the point when a blockbuster doesn't follow this traditional tight 3-act model, like The Last Jedi, it's met with conflicting opinions from fans and film critics. Again, I do think this critique of franchises, and Marvel in particular, is warranted, but dismissing the idea that these films are cinema seems to reduce the copious amounts of work that goes into creating such films. Yet that isn't Scorsese's intention when making these comments. In recent years, long-form TV has been just as powerful in its storytelling, often allowing viewers to sink their teeth into a cast of characters and the complexities they have to offer. Yet Scorsese says,
I thought for a while maybe long-form TV is cinema. It's not. It simply isn't. You know, it's a different viewing experience. You could look at 3 episodes, 2, 4, 10, one week, second episode the second week. That's not, it's a different kind of thing. So there's got to be still, what has to be protected is the singular experience of experiencing a picture, ideally with an audience.
This isn't dismissing long-form TV as an art form. Scorsese simply just doesn't believe this is cinema. The definition of cinema he's operating with is a narrow one. Yet is it justifiable? And how do we distinguish between these two types of cinema? As the MCU has been expanding, it's sort of been operating more traditionally like long-form TV, with each film, and now TV show, a new installment in the wider story at large. Franchises in general tend to operate on this model. Viewers are desperate to see where their favourite character is at now, and rush out to the cinema to see the latest development in the character's life, or to see how the state of their favourite fictional world will change with the newest film or TV show. And recently, the number of franchises, or rather the desperation from Hollywood studios to build major franchises, has become glaringly apparent. And why are these studios opting to rehash a franchise from years ago, or to spin off another film of a beloved franchise? Well, that answer is easy. Money. Hollywood studios producing blockbusters for financial gain isn't a new idea. In the early 1960s, the studio system began to collapse due to the changing demographics in audiences and the yearning for more varied types of films in cinemas. Since Hollywood studios weren't producing these films, European films, both art house and commercial, alongside Japanese cinema, really resonated with American audiences. During this time, Hollywood studios were experiencing economic hardship after numerous box office flops. Pair this with the abandonment of the Hays Code, which was a set of industry guidelines which major studios adhered to, acting as a form of self-censorship, and the introduction of the new MPAA rating system. This paved the way for New Hollywood. Studios were frantically trying to change strategy, and this desperation led to major studios giving more creative control to younger creatives, in an attempt to garner the same love audience had been exhibiting for European art films and the like. One of the defining films of the start of this movement was Bonnie and Clyde. When the film was first screened to Jack L. Warner, then CEO of Warner Brothers, he expressed disdain for the film. This led to distribution executives at Warner Brothers giving the film a low-key premiere and a more restrained release. This decision was backed up by numerous scathing reviews of the film when it first came out, for its depiction of violence and lack of moral values. However, the film divided critics, and there was praise for it. In particular, famed critic Pauline Kael's review in The New Yorker was positive and led many to re-evaluating it. In December 1967, the cover story of Time was about said film, and the article celebrated it for being a new type of cinema, paving the way for American New Wave cinema. This turnaround and praise from critics allowed it to be re-released, making it not only a financial success, but a critical success too, with it being nominated for Best Picture, and helping pave the way for New Hollywood. It was these early successes that allowed studios to become more trusting in their creatives. Gone were the days of studio-controlled films. Often studios were relinquishing complete control to these young filmmakers. And in the mid-1970s, audiences were treated to idiosyncratic and innovative films from emerging artists like Spielberg, Lucas, Scorsese, and Coppola. And studios reaped the benefits of this system. It was a real win-win. Creatives were allowed to express themselves unprovoked, giving audiences original, thoughtful, and morally complex films that generated a lot of money, not by having a big opening weekend, but from letting the films speak for themselves. Films often stayed in cinemas for numerous months, and it was often word of mouth, not necessarily excessive marketing campaigns, that drove viewers to the cinema. Creatives were actually making art they wanted to make, and it was a financial success. Things started to change though, with the release of one film in particular, Jaws. Despite the word blockbuster being used before 1975, it wasn't until the release of Jaws that cemented this word as a colloquialism we still use now. Before 1975, studios viewed the summer months as being low turnout months for cinemas. The release of Jaws in June 1975 was done so to scare beachgoers. Little did studios know though that the timing of this release would change the landscape of film distribution. Jaws is often marked as starting the blockbuster era. 2 years later, Star Wars also came out during the summer to financial success, and thus starting the trend of the summer blockbuster. Studios began to pivot from the New Hollywood model, opting to release fewer, bigger budget event films that appealed to the masses and had large marketing campaigns. It was two of the pioneers of the New Hollywood movement that also gave rise to the blockbuster era. As famed critic Roger Ebert wrote, Spielberg changed the course of modern Hollywood history. Jaws was a hit of vast proportions, inspiring executives to go for the home run instead of the base hit. And it came out in the summer, a season the major studios had generally ceded to cheaper exploitation films. Within a few years, the Jaws model would inspire an industry in which budgets ran wild because the reward seemed limitless, in which summer action pictures dominated the industry, and in which the hottest young directors wanted to make the great American blockbuster. Despite being a financial success, this new age of cinema wasn't met with complete adoration. In 1980, film critic Pauline Kael proposed a not too dissimilar argument to the one Scorsese is making now, in her essay in The New Yorker, Why Are Movies So Bad? She argues that rotten pictures are making money, and that since that's all that studios care about, why would they care to make anything better? This essay received a lot of criticism at the time, so clearly this issue isn't one that has suddenly appeared after Scorsese's comments on Marvel. It is something that has been questioned for some time. And while both of their wording I think comes off a little harsh on the creators who make blockbusters, there is clearly merit in what they're saying. But I think the state of cinema right now is more concerning, and Scorsese's warnings are completely warranted. Looking at the box office numbers for last year, it is an undeniable fact that supports Scorsese's argument. Specifically looking at the US box office figures from last year. Out of the top 10 films, 9 of them are either reboots, sequels, or installments in a cinematic franchise, and the single original film there, Free Guy, is distributed by Disney. When Scorsese is saying that Marvel isn't cinema, you can agree with that or you can dispute it. I think it just depends on your definition of cinema. What you can't dispute is the fears he's expressed for the idea of original, risky, innovative films. Films he made alongside other filmmakers during the New Hollywood movement, disappearing. Because if they aren't making money, why will studios continue to make them? Not only are smaller original films being neglected financially, but they're also being dismissed as pieces of art by audiences. This became glaringly apparent to me watching this year's Oscars. I thoroughly enjoyed most of the Best Picture nominees this year, and despite the event being criticised every year for being awful, I was excited to see some of the creatives of my favourite films of the year be acknowledged for their work. Instead, what viewers got were comedians making fun of how they couldn't even sit through a film that was nominated for Best Picture, and the removal of 8 technical awards with shortened speeches that were pre-filmed to make room for a weird pandering section of fan favourites that included films people actually saw that year. This is furthering a divide between what normal viewers consider highbrow and between financially successful films that they want to watch. It seems like the notion of releasing a purely original film to box office success and also audience acclaim, like the New Hollywood movement, is under threat. And unfortunately, as Hollywood seems to be dominated by a few studios, this isn't likely to change anytime soon. Hollywood is dominated by one major studio in particular, Disney, with nearly a third of the entertainment industry being owned by the House of Mouse. This presents an even greater problem as Disney as of late has been in the business of making, on the most part, reboots, remakes, sequels and installments into their numerous franchises, which is the risk-averse model of filmmaking Scorsese expresses fear for. There's always been discussions around Disney being a monopoly, but I think this became alarmingly apparent with the release of their latest film, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. There was a lot of talk about the absurd amount of screenings this film received across all cinemas. For instance, in a cinema in New York City, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness played over 60 times in one day. Now, one could argue that the reason so many screenings are needed is because of the spoiler culture that comes with Marvel films. But is every one of those screenings really packed full? What's sad is that when a film like this is dominating screens in a cinema, this leaves little room for more original films or indie films that already have a hard time competing with the tentpole blockbusters. It's gotten so bad that independent releases often avoid releasing at the same time as studio tentpole films, as they know they will flood cinemas. The main films that are available to see in cinemas are blockbusters, and rarely will a small film see as larger distribution. This is because the major studios hold all the cards when it comes to distribution, especially Disney. There's numerous accounts of Disney's domination over cinema screenings. Jeff Bach, a box office analyst, says, "There's no negotiating with Disney. It usually sets the terms. They'll say something like, 'Listen, if you don't play this in 12 screens for 4 weeks, we're not giving you our next film.' And it's hard to argue with that when Disney is responsible for most of the highest grossing films of the last few years. The argument then becomes that audiences are receptive to spectacle, not storytelling, as it's the franchise films that are making money at the box office. But I think this is a little reductive. Firstly, I think the domination of franchise films at the cinema makes it hard for audiences to show that they want to see more original films. Also, when an original film strikes a chord with audiences, there is a result that reflects this. Most recently, this has happened with Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is A24's most financially successful film to date, having grossed over $60 million at the box office. Purely through word of mouth and amazing reviews, this film has managed to surpass its expectation for its box office revenue. Yet with Everything Everywhere All at Once, there's The Northman. The Northman is an original blockbuster, a rarity in cinemas now, costing around $70 to $90 million to make. Its box office to date is around $67 million, so it didn't even break even on its budget. You could argue a multitude of things, that the film wasn't that great, which having seen the film I would respectfully disagree, that it wasn't a film audiences would enjoy, or that it didn't have a good marketing campaign. It doesn't matter the reason why, I think it's indicative of the issue at large. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness made $90 million on its first day alone, just in America. This is more than Everything Everywhere All at Once has made in its whole theatrical run. This has nothing to do with the quality of these three films mentioned. It just speaks volumes how hard it is for something that isn't already part of a franchise to really be a financial success. And when original ideas are having to compete against box office juggernauts like these franchise films, it's not hard to see why major studios are skeptical to greenlight original projects, especially in the post-pandemic era when audiences are still skeptical about returning to the cinema. The things that draw people back are most likely these more fantastical spectacles that are a part of franchises they already enjoy, and are less likely to go out and risk seeing an original film. In recent years, there's been another trend that's changed the landscape of distribution, and that's the endless amount of streaming services being offered to viewers. Streaming services bring with them a plethora of exciting new opportunities and a lot more challenges. Filmmakers who are unable to get their films financed through the traditional studio system have opted to produce them through streaming services, where their creative vision is unimpeached by a studio. They get to create the film they want. Most notably, this happened with Scorsese's The Irishman. Despite this being a great avenue for filmmakers to make the films they want to make, it perhaps isn't the way they want them to be distributed. The large theatrical release, the thrill of seeing their film on the big screen, isn't there anymore. Instead, a viewer can enjoy The Irishman on an iPhone. And this isn't emerging filmmakers who are struggling to get their films financed through the traditional studio model. This is Scorsese, one of the biggest directors on the planet. The other problem with streaming services is that filmmakers are competing with an endless amount of content that is available to the user at all times, and there's no real barometer for the quality of the content that is suggested to a user. Netflix in particular seems to operate on a quantity over quality model. In 2021 alone, Netflix released 257 original films. In comparison, Disney, the biggest company in the entertainment industry, released around 30 films, including theatrical films and streaming films. So it's no wonder that filmmakers are apprehensive about putting their films on streaming services, as it might get lost in the void of endless films. Since the availability of content at home is so easy now, this is also playing into the structure that cinemas should be dominated by blockbusters. Audiences might enjoy storytelling, but when they can access good storytelling anywhere, cinemas become places for spectacle, for the latest blockbuster. Films that aren't spectacles get left behind and don't bring in money, so why give them an extra few screens when the cinemas can give them to the latest superhero film that will guarantee at least a few people in the screen? So where do films go from here? How do future films combat and compete against the huge blockbuster franchises? With the release of Top Gun Maverick and it being such an all-out success, it brings into question the role of the Hollywood star. Long ago are the films that would be able to pack cinemas based on the cast alone, and I think Tom Cruise might be the one exception to this. The way that he fully embraces his films and everything that goes into them, and also pushes back against the streaming model to make sure his films are theatrically released, is the antithesis to what Marvel have created. Marvel films are ensemble films, even if they're not part of the team-up films. The amount of A-list talent that is on screen simply in a solo film, let alone a team-up film, is insane. Take Spider-Man Far From Home for example. In that film you have Tom Holland, Zendaya, Samuel L. Jackson, Jake Gyllenhaal, Jacob Batalon, Jon Favreau, Marissa Tomei. The list goes on. People have become so used to seeing ensemble casts in films that the idea of a singular Hollywood star is dead. I think this trend in casting is making its way over to original projects in the hopes of receiving an ounce of success that Marvel has had with this model. For example, two of the biggest films slated for 2023, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer and Greta Gerwig's Barbie, have some of the most stacked casts of any film recently. Maybe this model will work, and maybe people will be drawn back into the cinema to see more artistic outings instead of installments in their favourite franchises. It's clear though that original films are having to adapt to survive against the huge tentpole blockbusters. So is Marvel killing cinema? Killing is perhaps a little hyperbolic. Changing, overshadowing, creating fear for the future, those fit better. But Scorsese is right. We do need to be concerned about the impact Marvel and other larger studios are having on smaller creatives, or creatives who want to express a story without the interference of studios who want to maximize profits to have some sort of success Marvel has had. If all cinemas are showing are these flashy spectacles, regardless of the quality of said films, then this leaves no room for more original, smaller scale films. There are still avenues for these films, but they rarely see the widespread distribution or financial success due to their inability to compete with larger studios. These artistic endeavours are swallowed up by blockbuster franchises and are unable to do anything about it. Where do things go then? I don't have an answer to that. Perhaps cinema goers will start to embrace more original, innovative films that take risks, or cinemas might become a place to see the latest blockbuster, relegating the more individual artistic films to art house cinemas. The thing that won't change is that these riskier pieces of art will be out there. You just might need to look a little harder. Thanks for watching this video. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you make of the current landscape of cinema and where you see it heading. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content like this. And don't forget to let me know in the comments below what you found in frames.